A big welcome to everyone joining us this evening for the event Palestine Betrayed, reporting on a modern-day genocide. My name is Michaela Sahar, and I'm a core member of Non-Fiction Lab at RMIT, as well as a member of the Palestinian diaspora community in Australia. It's my great honour to welcome tonight, on behalf of Non-Fiction Lab at RMIT and our partner Free Palestine Melbourne, our esteemed speaker, the award-winning journalist and author Chris Hedges, and to welcome also my friend and colleague Maham Mughrabi, who will enrich the dialogue of our event this evening. It is really important that we could come together and make a space for this necessary and timely forum. So a big thank you to everyone who has worked tirelessly to make it happen. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and to say that Wurundjeri land was never ceded, nor any of the country on the continent, now known as Australia. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and particularly to First Nations members of our audience this evening. Always was, always will be. This evening's event will take the following format. We will begin with a talk from Chris Hedges, followed by a closed discussion with Maham Mughrabi, and finally we will include audience questions in the discussion. You will note the QR code on your seat and possibly behind me. This is available to you to submit questions you wish to put to our guests this evening. While you can submit questions early and often, please know they are curated, and we will select questions that are likely to extend the conversation rather than revisiting aspects of the talk. And so to our honoured guest, Chris Hedges. Chris is a former foreign correspondent for the New York Times, where he reported from conflicts in Central America, the Middle East, and the Balkans. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of 16 books, including several New York Times bestsellers. He has taught at Columbia, NYU, Princeton, and the University of Toronto, and since 2013 has taught incarcerated students in New Jersey through Rutgers University. He hosts the Chris Hedges Report. In his newest book, A Genocide Foretold, Hedges offers an account of Gaza under genocide, which he connects to the Palestinian history of dispossession and ethnic cleansing, known in Arabic as the Nakba. He tells us early in the book, there are no surprises in Gaza. So how, one might ask, could the horror of the last 2 years in Gaza occur and be allowed to occur? This is in part what Hedges sets out to illuminate. Early he reflects, and I quote, "I had wondered if I had done enough or if it was even worth the risk. But you go on because to do nothing is to be complicit. You report because you care. You make it hard for the killers to deny their crimes." In so doing, Hedges joins the many scholars and writers of the last 77 years who have brought their considerable intellect and skill to bear on elucidating the injustice which Palestinian people have experienced, none more so than the Palestinian people in Gaza. This, as Hedges makes clear, is not just under Israel's recent obliteration, but the decades of siege to which Israel has subjected Gaza and the many more decades of dispossession and ethnic cleansing visited upon all Palestinian people in our ancestral lands. As a scholar of narrative, I see in Hedges' work the vital recognition that it is not what happens in Gaza, as my own mentor Ghassan Haj once wrote, but rather Gaza itself that is in a permanent state of criminality. Gaza has been created as a site of exception, and outside of aerial assaults, it remains very far from normal. War and the absence of war can neither describe this reality nor capture the systemic failures that make it possible. But to this structural and systemic failure, Hedges brings a wealth of testimony from the Palestinian people he has worked alongside and among, and about whom he reflects on early in the book as follows. And yet, Palestinians endure, refusing to submit, resisting despite the overwhelming odds, grasping at tiny kernels of hope from bottomless wells of despair. There is a word for this: heroic. When I read this, I was reminded of the powerful speech Lebanese-Australian writer Abbas Al-Zain gave to accept the National Biography Award in July this year. His acceptance speech for the most valuable biography prize in this country was turned down for publication by all major media outlets. In it, he reminds us of both the power of story and the necessity of understanding how we are connected, how we are all connected to the genocide in Gaza. There he writes, "We must record one way or another the more than 61,000 biographies cut short in Gaza, or at least honour them with a measure of justice for the unspeakable crimes committed against them, and the certainty that every life and every act of recording matters, because when we are momentarily silenced by war and power, together we become a meadow of eyes, seeing, witnessing, remembering, and this they can never take away from us." This call is of particular relevance, I think, to my own research group here at RMIT. For what is the use of our skills as storytellers if we do not bear witness as the meadow of eyes, and if we do not amplify the stories of our brothers and sisters in Gaza? And of course, Hedges uses the power of his platform and his voice to amplify the voices and prosecute the case of the Palestinian people. As my friend, the poet and writer Mahmoud al-Shah, who endured the Gaza genocide, wrote 1 year into this nadir of human experience, "Please continue to liberate me by using my words and sharing them in whole or in part without needing my permission. Just talk about me. Tell the people around you about my story and the story of my people who have been living through genocide." In A Genocide Foretold and the tireless work of the Chris Hedges report, our guest this evening has surely heeded these requests. At an event last night, Chris told us in response to a question a student posed to him that the thing that drives his work is anger. But listening to his varied and fascinating stories about the people he has worked with, I have to contradict him on that, because I believe that work requires also a great deal of love. Please join me in welcoming Chris Hedges.
It's wonderful to be in Australia, my first visit, which has produced the greatest journalists, I would argue, of our era, Julian Assange, John Pilger, who I love, but who could be a real pain in the ass. I once put him on spam. I just want to say before I begin that this talk is not sponsored by Raytheon, BAE Systems, or Thales, which sell weapons to Israel to sustain the genocide. It is not sponsored by Amazon Web Services, which provides cloud infrastructure to Israeli defense and intelligence agencies, or Deloitte or MasterCard, which also do business with the apartheid state of Israel. And this is how you know we are not at the National Press Club of Australia. There are two types of war correspondents. The first type does not attend press conferences. They do not beg generals and politicians for interviews. They take risks to report from combat zones. They send back to their viewers or readers what they see, which is almost always diametrically opposed to official narratives. This first type, in every war I covered, is a tiny minority. Then there is the second type, the inchoate blob of self-identified war correspondents who play at war. Despite what they tell editors and the public, they have no intention of putting themselves in danger. They are pleased with the Israeli ban on foreign reporters into Gaza. They plead with officials for background briefings and press conferences. They collaborate with their government minders who impose restrictions and rules that keep them out of combat. They slavishly disseminate whatever they are fed by officials, much of which is a lie, and pretend it is news. They join little jaunts arranged by the military, dog and pony shows where they get to dress up and play soldier and visit outposts where everything is controlled and choreographed. The mortal enemy of these poseurs are the real war reporters, and in this case, the Palestinian journalists in Gaza. These reporters expose them as toadies and sycophants, discrediting nearly everything they disseminate. For this reason, the poseurs never pass up a chance to question the veracity and motives of those in the field. I watched these snakes do this repeatedly to my colleagues, Robert Fisk and John Pilger, and of course, Julia. When war reporter Ben Anderson arrived at the hotel where journalists covering the war in Liberia were encamped, in his words, getting drunk at bars on expenses, having affairs, and exchanging information rather than actually going out and getting information, his image of war reporters took a huge hit. I thought, finally, I'm amongst my heroes, Anderson said. This is where I've wanted to be for years. And then me and the cameraman I was with, who knew the rebels very well, he took us out for about 3 weeks with the rebels. We came back to Monrovia. The guys in the hotel bar said, "Where have you been?" We thought you'd gone home. We said, "We went out to cover the war. Isn't that our job? Isn't that what you're supposed to do?" The romantic view I had of foreign correspondence was suddenly destroyed in Liberia, he went on. I thought actually a lot of these guys are full of shit. They're not even willing to leave the hotel, let alone the safety of the capital, and actually do some reporting. The dividing line, which occurred in every war I covered, defines the reporting on the genocide in Gaza. It is not a divide of professionalism or culture. Palestinian reporters expose Israeli atrocities and implode Israeli lives. The rest of the press does not. Palestinian journalists targeted and assassinated by Israel pay as many great war correspondents do with their lives, although in far greater numbers. Israel has murdered 245 journalists in Gaza by one count and more than 273 by another. The goal is to shroud the genocide in darkness. No war I covered comes close to these numbers of dead. Since October 7th, Israel has killed more journalists than the US Civil War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, and Vietnam War, including conflicts in Cambodia and Laos, the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, which I covered, and the post-9/11 war in Afghanistan combined, according to an April 2025 study by Brown University. Journalists in Palestine leave wills and record videos to be read or played at their death. On a sweltering afternoon a few weeks ago, I was in the office of Palestine TV in Cairo, talking with Salman al-Bashir, who was the network's correspondent in Gaza. On the evening of November 2nd, 2023, Salman was scheduled for the night broadcast. It was, he tells me ruefully, the 106th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which in 1917 committed the British government to establishing, quote, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Palestine TV's reporter Mohammed Abu Hateb was concluding his 6-hour shift at 7 p.m. on the grounds of Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. After reporting on the ongoing bombings and destruction, he handed broadcasting over to Salman. Abu Hateb, whose apartment was next to the hospital, went home. Most of the journalists, because traveling any distance in Gaza is too dangerous, slept in tents on the hospital grounds. There was an explosion near the hospital, Salman says on the video he shows me of his broadcast that night. We can hear an explosion. It is very loud. Television presenter Duha Shami in the Ramallah studio says to Salman, it sounds close. Yes, Salman says on air. There has been an explosion. I see the ambulances. I will let you know when we have any news. A member of the emergency team at the hospital runs towards Salman, shouting, Mohammed Abu Hateb, Mohammed Abu Hateb, your friend, your colleague has been martyred. They targeted the house of Abu Hateb. Salman stops. He looks into the camera and says, the target was apparently the house of Mohammed Abu Hateb's family. A lot of people have been killed. Mohammed Abu Hateb was apparently martyred. Salman stands in front of the camera wearing a blue flak jacket with the word press emblazoned on it. He is wearing a blue helmet and holds a microphone. There is no international protection at all, no immunity, he says to the camera tearfully, as the red lights of an ambulance flash behind him. These flak jackets and helmets do not protect us. They are just slogans that we wear. They do not protect journalists at all. Here we are victims, losing our lives one after another at no cost, he says, as he removes the chin strap of his helmet and takes the helmet off. We are waiting for our turn, one after another. He undoes his flak jacket and lets it drop to the ground. We can't take it anymore, he says emotionally on camera. We're exhausted. Here we become martyrs. It is only a matter of time. No one sees us or the size of this catastrophe. No one sees the crime we are experiencing in Gaza. Psychologically, I couldn't accept it, he tells me in Cairo. I was with him 20 minutes earlier. Now he was dead. They brought his body to the hospital. I refused to look at him. The people who saw him told me half of his face had blown away. In the video, which he shows me, he turns away from the camera and sobs. Duha in Ramallah folds her head into her hands and wipes away tears. We are victims on live television, he says in the broadcast. Mohammed Abu Hateb was here half an hour ago. He left us along with his wife, his son, his brother, and other members of his family. Salman shows me a video of Mohammed's funeral. He is one of the pallbearers. Mohammed's body is wrapped in a white shroud. His blue flak jacket and a microphone lie on top of his body along with a small Palestinian flag. There is no God but God, the crowd shouts. The martyrs are God's beloved. Salman then shows me a video of the gutted remains of Mohammed's apartment where he and 10 family members were killed. Did you do anything differently after Mohammed was killed, I asked. I became very cautious, he told me. How, I asked. With my language. I started speaking very professionally. I talked about the war and the details of the war without using words other journalists were using. I tried not to aggravate the Israelis. I no longer referred to them as Zionists or the new Nazis. I stopped using words like messianic. I stopped calling them the Israeli Occupation Army. I called them the Israeli Army. Salman continued his work until his friend, the Al Jazeera cameraman, Samir Abu Dhaka, who had Belgian citizenship, was killed on December 15, 2023, in a drone strike. Samir had sent his family, including his 4 children, to Belgium, but he refused to leave Gaza. He, in Wael al-Duha, Al Jazeera Gaza's bureau chief, had been covering the aftermath of an Israeli strike that killed at least 20 people at Haifa School in Han Yunis, which was being used as a shelter for displaced families. Wael was wounded in his hand and stomach, but managed to escape. The Israeli soldiers and hovering drones fired on ambulances and medics attempting to reach Samir. 3 rescue workers were killed. Samir, who was 45, bled to death over 5 hours. I was with Samir on the day before he was martyred, Salman says softly. That was it. I couldn't continue. I had to leave Gaza. In August 2025, when Middle East Eye journalist Mohammed Salama and Ahmed Abu Aziz, Reuters photojournalist Hussam al-Masri, and freelancers Moaz Abu Taha and Mariam Daga, who had worked with several media outlets, including the Associated Press, were killed, with 15 others at Nasser Hospital in a double tap strike, which is designed to kill first responders following the initial strike. How did Western news agencies respond? Israeli military says strikes on Gaza hospital targeted what it says was a Hamas camera, the Associated Press reported. IDF claims hospital strike was aimed at Hamas camera, announced CNN. Israeli army says 6 terrorists killed on Monday strikes on Gaza hospital, the AFP headline read. Initial inquiry says Hamas camera was target of the Israeli strike that killed journalists, Reuters reported. Israel claims troops saw Hamas camera before deadly hospital attack, Sky News explained. And for the record, the camera belonged to Reuters. The news agency said Israel was fully aware they were filming from the hospital because they gave the IDF the coordinates. Al Jazeera correspondent Anas al-Sharif, one of the most popular journalists in Gaza, who reported daily on the genocide, received, like many journalists, constant death threats on his phone. In November 2023, the Israeli military ordered Anas to cease reporting and leave Gaza, northern Gaza. They sent him messages informing him that he was being tracked. His family home was bombed, killing his father. The Israeli military's Arabic spokesman accused him of terrorism and being a Hamas operative, overseeing the launching of rockets into Israel. The Committee to Protect Journalists called the sustained assaults on Anas a, quote, precursor to assassination. The Tel Aviv-based magazine Plus 972 reported that the Israeli military has a special unit called the Legitimization Cell, which carries out campaigns to portray Palestinian journalists as Hamas operatives in an effort to justify their assassination. In October 2024, Anas was with a group of journalists who were fired on by Israeli soldiers in Jabalia. Cameraman Fadi El-Wahidi, clearly marked as a journalist in his flak jacket, was shot in the neck and paralyzed. Soon after, the Israeli military accused 6 journalists, including Anas, of being militants. His Instagram account was taken down. On May 2nd, 2025, after Israel blocked food and humanitarian aid, Anas reported on the mounting malnutrition and starvation in Gaza. In July, he posted on social media that he is drowning in hunger and called the starvation a slow death. In one broadcast, he choked back tears as a malnourished woman behind him fainted. A bystander shouted, "Keep going, Anas, you are our voice." On August 10th, 2025, Anas and 3 other journalists were killed by an Israeli drone while in their media tent outside Al-Shifa Hospital. And how was this killing of a journalist reported by their colleagues in the Western press? Israel kills Al Jazeera journalist it says was Hamas leader, Reuters titled its story, despite the fact that Anas was part of a Reuters team that had won a 2024 Pulitzer Prize. German newspaper Bild published a front-page story headline, "Terrorist disguised as journalist killed in Gaza." Colleagues of these Palestinian journalists in the Western press broadcast from the border fence with Gaza, decked out in flak jackets and helmets, where they have as much chance of being hit by shrapnel or a bullet as being struck by an asteroid. They scurry like lemmings to briefings by Israeli officials. They are not only the enemies of truth, but also the enemies of journalists doing the real work of war reporting, and this divide is one I experienced in all the wars I covered. When Iraqi troops attacked the Saudi border town of Hafji during the First Gulf War, Saudi soldiers fled in panic. 2 French photographers and I watched frantic soldiers commandeering fire trucks and racing south. U.S. Marines pushed the Iraqis back. But in Riyadh, the press was told of our gallant Saudi allies defending their homeland. Once fighting ended, the press bus stopped a few miles down the road from Hafji. The pool reporters clambered out, escorted by military minders. They did stand-ups with the distant sound of artillery and smoke as a backdrop and repeated the lies the Pentagon wanted told. Meanwhile, the 2 photographers and I were detained as we left Hafji and beaten by enraged Saudi military police, furious that we had documented the panicked flight of Saudi soldiers. My refusal to abide by the press restrictions in the First Gulf War saw the other New York Times reporters in Saudi Arabia write a letter to the foreign editor saying I was ruining the paper's relationship with the U.S. military. And if not for the intervention of R.W. Johnny Apple, who had covered Vietnam, I would have been sent back to New York. Now, I don't fault anyone for not wanting to go into a war zone. This is a sign of normality. It is rational and it is understandable. Those of us who volunteer to go into combat, my colleague Clyde Haberman at the New York Times once said that I would parachute into any war with or without a parachute, have obvious personality defects. But I fault those who pretend to be war correspondents. They do tremendous damage. They peddle false narratives. They mask reality. They serve as witting or unwitting propagandists. They discredit the voices of the victims and exonerate the killers. They betray those who take great risks to report the truth. When I covered the war in El Salvador, before I worked for the New York Times, the paper's correspondent dutifully regurgitated whatever the embassy fed her. This had the effect of making my editors, I worked for the Dallas Morning News, as well as editors of other correspondents who did report the war, question our veracity and quote-unquote impartiality. It made it harder for readers to understand what was happening. The false narrative neutered and often overpowered the real one. The slander used to discredit Palestinian colleagues claiming they are members of Hamas is sadly familiar. Many Palestinian reporters I know in Gaza are in fact quite critical of Hamas. But even if they have ties to Hamas, so what? Israel's attempt to justify targeting journalists from the Hamas-run Al-Aqsa Media Network is also a violation of Article 79 of the Geneva Convention. I work with reporters and photographers who had a wide variety of beliefs, including Marxist-Leninists in Central America, and this did not prevent them from being honest. I was in Bosnia and Kosovo with a Spanish cameraman, Miguel Gil Moreno, who was later killed with my close friend, Kurt Shore. Miguel was a member of the right-wing Catholic group Opus Dei. He was also a journalist of tremendous courage, great compassion, and moral probity, despite his rather bizarre opinions about Francisco Franco. But he did not lie. In every war I covered, I was attacked as supporting or belonging to whatever group the government, including the US government, was seeking to crush. I was accused of being a tool of the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front in El Salvador, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unity during the civil war in Guatemala, the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, Hamas, the Muslim-led government in Bosnia, and the Kosovo Liberation Army. John Simpson of the BBC, like many Western reporters, argues that, and I'm quoting, "The world needs honest, unbiased eyewitnesses reporting to help people make up their minds about the major issues of our time. This has so far been impossible in Gaza." The assumption that if Western reporters were in Gaza, the coverage would improve is risible. Trust me, it would not. Israel bans the foreign press because there is a bias in Europe and the United States in favor of reporting by Western reporters. It is aware that the scale of the genocide is too vast for Western outlets to hide or obscure, despite all the ink and airtime they give to Israeli and US apologists. Israel also cannot continue its systematic campaign of annihilation of journalists in Gaza if it has to contend with foreign media in its midst. Israel lies amplified by Western media outlets, including my former employer, the New York Times, are worthy of Pravda. Beheaded babies, babies cooked in ovens, mass rape by Hamas, errant Palestinian rockets that cause explosions at hospitals and massacre civilians, secret command tunnels and command centers in schools and hospitals, journalists who direct Hamas rocket units, protesters of the genocide on college campuses who are anti-Semites and supporters of Hamas. I covered the conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis much of that time in Gaza for 7 years. And if there is one indisputable fact, it is that Israel lies like it breathes. The decision by Western reporters to give credibility to these lies, to give them the same weight as documented Israeli atrocities, is a cynical game. The reporters know these lies are lies, but they and the news outlets that employ them prize access, in this case, access to Israeli and US officials above truth. The reporters, as well as their editors and publishers, fear becoming targets of Israel and the powerful Israel lobby. And there is no cost for betraying the Palestinians because they are powerless. Call those lies out, and you will swiftly find your requests for briefings and interviews with officials rebuffed. You won't be invited by press officers to participate in staged visits to Israeli military units. You and your news organization will be viciously attacked. You will be left out in the cold. Your editors will terminate your assignment and maybe your employment, and your talks will be canceled at press clubs. This is not good for careers, and so the lies are dutifully reported, no matter how absurd. It is pathetic watching these reporters and their news outlets, as Robert Fisk writes, fight like tigers to join these pools in which they would be censored, restrained, and deprived of all freedom of movement on the battlefield. The barrage of Israeli lies, amplified and given credibility by the Western press, violates a fundamental tenet of journalism: the duty to transmit the truth to the viewer or reader. It legitimates mass slaughter. It refuses to hold Israel to account. It betrays Palestinian journalists, those reporting and being killed in Gaza. And it exposes the bankruptcy of Western journalists, whose primary attributes are careerism and cowardice. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. The Palestinian people have been betrayed by many people, but not by you. It's now my honour to welcome Maher Mughrabi to the stage for the second part of our evening. Maher is a Scottish Palestinian journalist and writer who has lived and worked in Australia for 22 years. He has lectured on the Israel-Palestinian conflict and its portrayal in media and culture at Melbourne and Monash universities. His writing has been published in Arena Journal and Magazine, Mianjin, In Press Magazine, and the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and he has been interviewed on Radio New Zealand and SBS Radio in English and Arabic, as well as appearing on the ABC's Q&A program, which made him so famous he's often recognised on the streets of London, and SBS Insight. I can see Maher blushing down the front. Maher, please join us on the stage. So Maher will facilitate a closed discussion with Chris, followed by putting some of your audience questions to him.
So, thank you, Chris. That was terrific. I wanted to start by asking you, the situation here in Australia, of course, as you've already pointed out, is that nobody has access to the field in Gaza. And so, what we know about this conflict is mediated through the Israeli perspective, the sort of common understanding of the Middle East conflict that exists in Western newsrooms. What I wanted to begin by asking you is, you've talked obviously a lot about the failings of media, both in your writing and tonight, in covering Gaza. How can this problem be rectified? Is it a question of reforming newsrooms, or is that model broken, in your opinion?
It's broken because the traditional news media is calcified and dying. And when institutions begin to die, they fold in on themselves and actually make the situation worse. So it becomes more constrictive in a desperate effort to placate, especially commercial interests that provide them advertising money, and they become more obsequious in terms of access. So the whole media, the traditional media model has evolved immensely from when I began, where you had major networks and newspapers that attempted to reach a broad audience. Now it's become completely siloed. So traditional media, like even the New York Times, caters to a particular demographic. In that case, largely liberal Democrats, just the way Fox News will cater to Republicans. The problem with that is that by catering to that demographic, it makes commercial sense, but not journalistic sense. They feed that demographic what it wants to hear. So we got the New York Times, digital subscribers are very fickle. They tend to drop their subscriptions more commonly than people who have the print subscriptions. And from surveys, they knew after Trump was elected the first time that a huge influx of subscribers hated Trump. So they slogged for 2 years the false story of Trump as a Russian asset. But they didn't pay a price for it because it's what their readers want to hear. So there's been such deep decay within these news organizations. They've lost tremendous amounts of credibility. I covered, of course, I lost my job at the New York Times because I said what you knew and what all of us who come out of the Middle East understand, which was the invasion of Iraq was going to be a debacle, which it was. But to say that at the time was, especially in the wake of 9/11, I was telling you before, I've always had to deal with death threats, but that was the worst. It was day after day. I would come into the office and the entire phone memory bank system was filled with death threats. There would have been more, but it ran out of space. That's where they sold, were full partners in the fantasy of weapons of mass destruction. On the genocide, they have peddled the story of Screams Without Words or whatever that stupid story was, which was full of holes. I've taught journalism at Columbia and other places. I would have failed it if a student had given it to me. So the media is in deep crisis, the traditional media. You have, at least for now, access to alternative media on digital platforms, but we're already under tremendous assault. Anytime I do on my show a thing on Gaza, I'm immediately demonetized on YouTube. The algorithms hit us all the time. I mean, like on X, for instance. So I have an X account. I don't run any of this. I have all these 24-year-old kids in Los Angeles who don't laugh at me a lot. But you know, it's like, it's so blatant because the X account stays at 279,000, and then you'll get new subscribers, then it drops back down to 279,000. I mean, it can't, it's obviously, it's got a cap. They put a cap on it. And, you know, speaking of Julian, look at his book, Cypherpunks, because he totally gets how all that in the short term or the medium term, these new digital platforms have given life to journalism, but in the long term, they are going to be systems of Orwellian control, because it's really the flick of a switch. I mean, I had a show on RT for 6 years. I didn't ever do a show on Russia, and it really drove the US government nuts because it was international, so it had huge following. And with the invasion of Ukraine, not only was RT shut down, but my entire archive was disappeared from YouTube, all of it, all 6 years. Yeah. So people like you and me, we're in a really, it's a very precarious moment, and the old media has failed, and we see it with the coverage of the genocide. But the people who control the digital platforms are our enemy. And they're all defense contractors. They're all tied with the intelligence industry and everyone else.
So what do you see as a way forward then? I mean, is there another way?
Well, I mean, we have to keep using it, you know, despite the fact that they hate us. And then when they shut us down, then we enter a kind of totalitarian capitalism. I mean, I don't like where we're going, but we are certainly, I mean, I covered the Stasi. I covered the collapse of the Stasi state in East Germany, and the tools they have in terms of monitoring and control are nothing. I mean, the Stasi didn't, in their greatest dreams couldn't have imagined. So, yeah, we're headed for a really dark place, and you see the rise of these authoritarian governments, like the United States, powerful proto-fascist movements in Germany, in France, Hungary, and it's a longer discussion, but it's the result of social inequality and neoliberalism and everything else. And Trump is, all the institutions that might, including the press, including the media, that potentially could thwart the Trump administration's consolidation of a police state have completely capitulated. And CBN and Larry Ellison, who's one of the richest men in the world, has not only just bought up CBS and appointed this arch-Zionist Bari Weiss to run the news division. And let me just say about it, it's not just that she's a Zionist, but if you look at her publication, The Free Press, it's just filled with lies and inaccuracies, and it's not even it's not even fact-based journalism. And he's trying to make a bid to buy HBO and CNN, the parent companies of and TikTok, because especially through TikTok and social media, they've not been able to hide this live-streamed genocide, and they don't have an answer anymore. I mean, especially once they instituted starvation as a weapon, they kind of could think of excuses for everything else. But once they started starving the entire population of Gaza, it was so transparent. The genocide was transparent. So they've shut down free speech on campuses. They are attempting to essentially control the messaging. But I covered Turkey, so I covered Turkey And the Turkish press before Erdogan was really good. Hurriyet and really, really great press. And then Erdogan did the same thing, but nobody reads Hurriyet anymore.
Yeah.
So, in fact, it's counterproductive. They'll destroy the credibility of these institutions. The credibility is already pretty shredded. And people will go look. I mean, the great former journalists, including the editor of Hurriyet, who's living in exile in Germany, they all have, YouTube channels and podcasts that have millions of followers. So people will find the truth, but as the state becomes more authoritarian, they will. I mean, look what they did to Julian. I mean, 14 years of torture. Yeah, I mean, look, we just have to. I wish I would give you a nice rosy picture.
No. It's necessary that people understand what's going on. And of course, that there are people here doing this kind of independent journalism as well, some of whom are escapees from the mainstream media. Chris, some years ago, Donald Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, proposed what Trump called the deal of the century to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And more recently, of course, Trump famously stood at a podium and talked about turning Gaza into a Riviera. And now we have the 20-point plan, as it's called. Do you take the 20-point plan more seriously than previous proposals?
No, it's a joke. I mean, read it. It doesn't even make any sense. Going all the way back to Camp David, I mean, having covered all of this stuff, including Oslo, it's always done in phases. But Camp David or Oslo, it was a far more serious effort. I mean, Israel gets what it wants. In the case of Camp David, it got recognition from Egypt, gave back to Sinai. Palestinians were not involved in Camp David. In the case of Oslo, it saw this is why Edward Said called Arafat the Paytan of the Palestinian people, gave up the right of return, essentially turned the PA into a colonial police force, and then every other phase that Israel was supposed to abide by, it ignored. So when Oslo was signed, they, I think, had about 200,000 Jewish colonists in the West Bank. It's now over 700,000. Arafat, who I knew very well, bristled under it. He wasn't compliant enough, and I think most of us who covered it are fairly convinced that the Israelis poisoned him to death, killed him. They had assassinated Abu Jihad, who I knew, and who was kind of the real. Arafat was a funny guy, but Abu Jihad was a very serious guy, and especially after the first Intifada, they landed on Tunis. Israeli commandos assassinated him. No, the plan, but it was never. I mean, that's why the big Israeli newspaper owned by the Adelsons, which is
Israel Hayom.
Yeah, which serves as a mouthpiece for Netanyahu and Messianic Zionism in an editorial said, don't worry about the plan, it's all rhetoric. It's not a workable plan. The Palestinians were not only involved, there's no timetable. The only timetable in the plan is the 72 hours by which the hostages have to be returned, and Israel, immediately began to violate. They were supposed to let in 600 trucks a day through Rafah. They've cut it. They've not. They control about 53% of Gaza physically, but actually they control all of Gaza with the drones, and they control all the border. They're already saying, and the thing about Gaza is 80% of Gaza is just rubble.
Yes.
And the Israeli hostages, Israel killed a lot of their own hostages through the bombing, but they didn't just kill the hostages, they killed the Hamas operatives who were guarding them, so nobody even knows where they are. And Israel is just, in Israel's, I think, what are we up to since, I think they've killed 9 Palestinians. They're very upfront about, Katz has talked about, preparing, destroying Hamas. Well, they'll get Hamas on the thing about disarming, so they've got to supposedly disarm. I mean, they've got to essentially abolish themselves, which isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not a serious plan. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. How can you take anything Trump does seriously?
Well, I mean, that's the reason I used that word, because whether you take him, I mean, people talked about taking him literally but not seriously, or seriously but not literally. But the fact is that he is power, and when power does things, it changes the reality that we all live in, as you said in answer to the first question. So, I mean, I feel like regardless of whether you take the 20-point plan seriously, you do have to somehow reckon with it. But you talked about Hamas, and I wanted to talk to you about that because, of course, since October the 7th, 2023, certainly in the media here, but almost everywhere, I would suggest, Hamas has been treated by commentators, political leaders, journalists, as an anathema, something that has to be removed or eradicated completely from Palestinian social and political life. It's been equated variously with Islamic State, the Taliban, the Nazis. Do you think this portrayal is justified, or is it a flawed portrayal?
It's a complete misreading of Hamas. It serves the interests of Israel and the Western governments to portray Hamas like this. But I knew one of the co-founders of Hamas, Dr. Abdul Aziz Rantisi, until he was assassinated in 2004, his son. I knew his successor, Nizar Iran. Hamas is a national liberation movement. And Rantisi made that very clear to me on numerous occasions, including arguing that, we accept anyone in the Palestine National Liberation Movement, including Christians. But I don't know, it's diminished, but it's probably about 12% of Palestinians are Christians. And then you have the issue of terror. So does Hamas use terrorism? Yes. But all liberation movements use terrorism, including the Zionist liberation movements pre-1948, the Irgun and others, Stern Gang. The IRA used quote-unquote terrorism, the ANC. I don't defend terrorism as a tactic, but when you don't have a Navy and you don't have an Air Force and you don't have mechanized units and you don't have artillery, then you have suicide vests. That's the way it works. It's not that terrorism isn't a part of the process, but they're not terrorists. First of all, they won the elections in 2006, whether you like them or not.
Yes.
And that characteristic of, what we call terrorism is part of the DNA of every resistance movement I've ever covered.
Yeah. And the thing is, I mean, you point out quite rightly, I mean, they won the election in 2006, and of course there have been no elections since then, not because of Hamas, but because the Palestinian polity has been placed outside normal processes. But I hear many people blame the Palestinians and say, well, they elected Hamas, when of course we know that the vast majority of the people living in Gaza aren't old enough to have voted for Hamas in 2006. But there is an important point to be made here about the fact that Hamas stood for election at all, because of course they knew they were standing for election in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, even though voting in East Jerusalem was made very difficult. And that in itself was a tacit acceptance of the system that existed at the time, a two-state reality. So we've seen in the past that Hamas can tailor their offering to reality. But you're right. I mean, I wanted to read something to the audience which I came across recently and which struck me as very relevant in this regard. The theme of terrorism as an element of North Vietnamese and NLF policy had the important effect of putting them outside the political realm, making them appear more as criminals than as a political movement or rival government. The language of law and order was common in television coverage. While a South Vietnamese government official taken by the Viet Cong was kidnapped, an NLF political cadre, or any Viet Cong taken by the government was always a Viet Cong suspect. Now you'll recognize here exactly what has been happening over the last few days, when you hear about Israeli hostages, but you never hear about Palestinian hostages. They're always prisoners, even though many of them have never been through any kind of judicial or criminal process they've never been charged with anything, they've never been found guilty of anything. And then it says, with the imagery of gratuitous savagery, television went a step further. It dehumanized the enemy, drained him of all recognizable emotions and motives, and banished him not only from the political sphere, but from human society itself. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were fanatical, suicidal, savage, half-crazed. They were lower than mere criminals. They were vermin. And I think that when you read that, and that was written about Vietnam, I think you can see the model for the coverage that exists now very clearly indeed. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask some of the questions that the audience have put forward. But before we do, some people in our audience might not know, Chris, that in addition to being a journalist, you're also a minister in the Presbyterian Church. Palestinians, like South Africans, have at times had reason to fear the doctrines associated with what the Scottish educator R.F. Mackenzie called the Scottish God. And Christian Zionism still plays a very significant role in this conflict. But I know that the largest branch of the Presbyterian Church in the United States has in recent years disavowed Christian Zionism completely. Do you think that Christian Zionists and their beliefs are still a major obstacle to changing US foreign policy in Palestine and Israel?
Yes, because especially among the younger generation of Jews, they're not buying this. They feel no emotional ties to the apartheid state of Israel, and many of them are quite vocal in opposing the genocide in the apartheid state. And so there's a swing towards, I wrote a book about them called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I consider them heretics. I wrote the book about a decade ago, and they were the connecting tissue in January 6th in the incursion into the Capitol. And they, Trump's just the face out front. Trump is a very limited, intellectually limited, morally bankrupt, narcissistic, corrupt con artist. And I mean, they just give him the Sharpie and he doesn't half the time know what he's signing. I mean, listen to him, he's an idiot. So, but the people behind him are not. They know exactly what they want, the Stephen Millers and these figures. Having covered the Christian right, they long have had a vision of a quote-unquote Christian nation, which is rapid. I mean, so that Christian Zionism or Christian fascism is filling Trump's ideological void, and it's very dangerous. It celebrates white supremacy, it celebrates empire, it celebrates raw, unfettered capitalism, it sacralizes all of this stuff. And my great mentor at Harvard Divinity School, his name was James Luther Adams. So your last year at Harvard, you do, like the British system, you do a tutorial, which I did with him. He was 80 at the time. He had been at the University of Heidelberg in 1935 and 1936 and had dropped out and joined Niemöller in the Confessing Church for a year until he was arrested by Gestapo and expelled. But there were a few things he said about that experience. One was how fast the universities capitulated to fascism, which we're seeing, and the media. And the rearguard action by the law courts, but because the Nazis had taken control of the hierarchy of the legal system in the same way that these people have taken control of it, you can't enforce it. But he also saw the parallels between the Christian fascist, Christian nationalist, and the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi. And when you look at fascism closely, it takes on the coloring of whatever peculiar characteristics of the national state. So Italian fascism harkened back to ancient Rome, was not particularly anti-Semitic until it got pressured by the Nazis. Nazism went to the Nordic myth and Wagner. And so fascism always, Franco ran a Catholic, with a veneer of the Catholic Church, a fascistic state. And that's how fascism is coming to America. Robert Paxton, in his book Anatomy of Fascism, said fascism, we wrote this several years ago, fascism won't come to America with jackboots and the swastika, it will come with the Christian cross and the flag and mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance. That's how fascism always works. We are rapidly becoming a fascistic nation, and if fascism is always the product of a bankrupt liberalism, that's another topic, but I wrote about it in a book called Death of the Liberal Class, and that's where we're headed. So I smell these people out because I'm biblically literate. You know, I know the Bible. My father was a minister. My mother was a seminary graduate. I smell these people out immediately. It has a cultish quality to it. And you have to think of Trump as a cult figure, not as a politician, and then everything makes sense.
I think that's very interesting because when you talk about Italian and German and American instances of this, I think as well of the way in which Putin has mobilized Orthodox Christianity in the service of a Russian nationalist project. Saving icons in Ukrainian churches and that kind of thing. I mean, he's made Christianity a big theme of his national push as well. So, I mean, it's interesting how in those situations the two opposing forces can seem to be on a similar trajectory. And of course, you're right. I mean, in some ways, nationalism often does cloak itself in that way. Certainly, even in the Arab world, that is happening as well. With the death of the liberal nationalist project, came Islamism and came a greater stress on religion as a uniting force. So that is very interesting. It's a very interesting observation. Now, to begin with some of the questions that I have here in front of me from the audience, and forgive me if your question doesn't get asked, or I tinker with it a little. So the first question I'd like to ask you, it says here that polls taken in Israel show a shocking indifference to the suffering of ordinary Palestinians. What do you think has happened in Israeli society to create that reaction?
Well, Ilan Pappé, the great Israeli historian, has written about this. He wrote an article, I think it was in 1999, about the system of indoctrination that begins in elementary school. People are taught to hate. And the way Palestinians are portrayed, the sense of eternal victimhood, all of this is, and he uses the word indoctrination. Everybody has to go into the army, which is a big indoctrination machine. And you see it in Israeli rhetoric, that human animals, Palestinian children, they call them little snakes. And of course, I covered the war in Yugoslavia. You use that rhetoric of dehumanization. You externalize evil. I mean, this is the most egregious sin of all of this, is that evil is embodied in the other, in this case, usually Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and that somehow if you eradicate those figures who are less than human, then evil is vanquished. And as somebody who comes out of divinity school, this is really, really dangerous. Because, and even in the Quran, they write about the various forms of jihad, but the highest form of jihad is the battle against the evil within you. And having covered war, I'm well aware of that the line between the victim and the victimizer is razor thin. Primo Levi is brilliant about this, and of course was persona non grata in Israel, because he talked about the collaboration within the camps, that evil wasn't only on the outside of the wire, it was on the inside of the wire. He condemns the Shoah as a vehicle to perpetuate hatred. He was very critical of the apartheid state, and so Israel has just drunk deep from this very dark elixir of unfettered, unbridled, messianic nationalism, and the flip side of nationalism is always racism. It's a racist society, and I don't read Hebrew, but I read the Hebrew press in translation, and Israelis are just fed this stuff day in and day out.
Why do you think Western media coverage of Gaza and Ukraine was so different? And what does it tell us about the priorities of media corporations and the narratives they create?
Well, the media, I worked at the New York Times. They're very good careerists. They know what will promote their career, and they know what will deep six their career. And they, look at the coverage of the encampments at universities. The way they were portrayed. I mean, it just was dishonest. I mean, the New York Times would race up to Columbia and rush to the Hillel house and find some Jewish student who, quote unquote, felt uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the police were unleashed on the campus, beating and arresting over 100 students. And faculty, including Jewish faculty, were being suspended. I mean, at Princeton, Ruha Benjamin is teaching on probation. It's insane. But that's just always the problem of the legacy establishment commercial press, is that they know what's good for their career, they know what's good for them, and that's why, because it's not really even coverage. They don't even make a pretense about coverage. But we all got to cheerlead the war in Ukraine. Everybody was like waving little Ukrainian flags.
Yeah.
And I covered a lot of war. I knew immediately that this was a proxy war, that the United States didn't give a damn about Ukraine or the Ukrainians, let them all bleed, let the country be destroyed. The goal was to degrade the Russian military and isolate Putin. And if they had to sacrifice Ukraine, every proxy war I covered is the same. But the media, it's just a giant echo chamber for this garbage and this propaganda, and it works. So if you look at the response to, look at how many newspapers and journalists signed open letters against Ukraine, the horrible Russian. I'm not defending what Putin did, although we baited him by expanding NATO. That's another story. I covered East Germany, and I covered the unification. I was in Berlin the night the wall came down, and I was there when Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker, I was in the room, promised Gorbachev, because they had to get Gorbachev's, the Soviet Union's acquiescence to reunify Germany, that they would not expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. That was a promise, I heard it. And they violated it after the collapse of the Soviet Union, one, to make billions of dollars from Raytheon and everyone else, but also because the hubris of this unipolar world, and et cetera, and the Russians, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin kept saying, stop, 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 and I'm not defending the invasion of Ukraine, and we know from WikiLeaks, actually, a leak by the ambassador who was in Moscow, later became the head of the CIA, and the cable says it doesn't matter the political stance within Russia, that's a red line, Ukraine, and you have to respect the historical memory. The Russians, or Soviet Union and Russia, was invaded 3 times through Ukraine. But yeah, that's juxtaposing the response of the press towards Ukraine and with the genocide in Gaza is just a perfect example of, it's what Chomsky calls worthy and unworthy victims.
Sure.
It's a really important point. So when I was covering the war in Salvador, we had all the American church women who were raped and murdered. At the same time, there was a Polish priest who was close to the Solidarity movement and was killed in Poland. Well, he was held up as a martyr and a hero. And even though those were American women, they were degraded. They weren't really nuns. They were part of the rebels. So that's very much about the Palestine conflict. The Palestinians are in the eyes of the power elite and in the eyes of the press who serves as their echo chamber, they're unworthy victims.
Yeah. I think what strikes me most about this is that when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, whatever your perspective is, and I suspect my perspective is quite different from yours, you can still hear the full spectrum of views to some extent. You can still hear a Russian argument, even if it's couched in terms of contempt within the Western press. But in the Western press, the Israeli perspective is there, but the Palestinian perspective is almost never presented from a Palestinian mouth. It's always mediated through a Western understanding of what Palestine must be about. And that's a fundamental problem to me, is that we still are not at the point where the Palestinian voice is part of it, any more than Palestinian input was part of the 20-point plan. It's not part, we still haven't reached the point. And I mean, very, very early on in this conflict, I put it to a senior newspaper editor at a newspaper that I won't name, that we have human stories about Israeli victims of this war, but we are not able to obtain human stories about Palestinian victims of this war because we simply cannot go into Gaza and cover it. And I said, it seems to me there is a case for not covering human stories about Israeli victims of this war until we have access to the Palestinian victims of this war. And he said, well, I think we can work around that. And I thought, how precisely does one work around that? Especially when, and this is something that comes out of your speech, Palestinian journalists working on the ground became targets themselves and were so easily discredited and devalued and debased, so that it became then, well, who is going to bring me the stories of Palestinians? And the answer is, of course, social media will bring you those stories unfiltered, unmediated, through your phone. But then you ask yourself, well, how do I know what I'm seeing? Well, and that is the role, that has historically been our role as journalists, is to say, this happened, I was there, this is how it worked, this is what happened to this person. Instead, what you're getting is a situation where it's fundamentally unmediated and you don't know who to trust. And that's precisely as Israel would like it, I think, is that there's no certainty, there's no truth.
Well, the only thing I would say is that there are news organizations like Al Jazeera who in fact have done, I think, a pretty good job of disseminating those stories.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think you're right, but there have been, in particular, Al Jazeera.
Yeah, and there's been a concerted campaign, of course, to discredit Al Jazeera as well. Yeah, I mean, but this is the, there is always these concentric circles of credibility, and the Arab voice, the Palestinian voice, finds itself pushed to the outside. And even more so, beyond even the Palestinian voice, of course, is the voice that would speak for Hamas or anybody connected to Hamas. So that is completely beyond the moral pale and unacceptable. And then there's the Palestinian voice, which is only acceptable under certain very stringent conditions, if it says the right things, and so on. And then we go into, but I mean, the heart of credibility is still the white person reporting from Israel or reporting from Europe or reporting from wherever they're reporting from. Yeah. I want to take you away from a moment from the immediate sort of subject. There's a question here which I have to admit introduces me to an aspect of your work I wasn't familiar with. It says, how important was the crisis of race and class you document in Losing Moses on the Freeway in shaping your worldview and leading you to become a journalist?
So I would say most of my worldview was formed very young because my father, who was a Presbyterian minister and a World War II veteran, he was in North Africa in World War II, he became a pacifist after the war. He was involved in the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, and as a kid he would take me. He was part of Concerned Clergy and Laity, which was organized by the great radical priests, the Berrigans, Phil and Dan Berrigan. And I remember him telling me that if the war was still going on and I was 18, he would go to prison with me. So I still have this vision of sitting for 2 years in a jail cell with my father. He was very involved in the civil rights movement. He came out of that old social gospel that, and then my uncle was gay, and my father was very outspoken about gay rights, for which the church threw him out. And he was told to stop speaking about equality for the GBLTQ community, and instead he organized an Easter service for them in the city of Syracuse, I did my undergraduate work at Colgate University, which was an hour, and he came and got me and he said, "This is the last time you'll ever hear me preach." And he got up and said, and you know, the church visited a lot of, it was cruel and sadistic to these people. And he said, got up and said, marriage is a sacrament. It's not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that doesn't honor the sacrament of marriage can't call itself Christian. And they threw him out. Now, that was, you can't teach morality. You can't. You have to show it. And so my course was set really, really early. And I've never deviated. I mean, the book you're referring to, Losing Moses on the Freeway, which was originally called the Decalogue, but it got to the marketing department of Simon & Schuster, and nobody knew what the Decalogue was, because they're all illiterate. And they forced me to change it, which I kind of regret doing. But it was based on Kieslowski's, the Polish filmmaker's brilliant film, The Decalogue, where each one was an hour filmed in a Warsaw housing complex that dealt with one of the issues of the Ten Commandments. But in a very idiosyncratic way. I mean, for instance, thou shalt not commit adultery. The woman wasn't married, but had a series of carnal relationships without love. For thou shalt not kill, the first minute or two is about someone murdering a cab driver, but then the rest of the film is about state murder, where he's taken to trial and executed. So I did that in a nonfiction form, but I don't think I've ever really strayed very far from that radical left Christianities in which I was raised. This understanding, as the great theologian James Cone writes, that we're called to stand with the crucified of the earth. And that if we truly stand with the oppressed, eventually we will be treated like the oppressed. One of the reasons I'm such a huge admirer of Julian, because that's precisely what happened. So, I mean, I always, as a reporter, went to distressed areas. Yeah. And these were the jobs that all my colleagues at the New York Times didn't want. When I told the editor-in-chief of the New York Times I wanted to cover the war in Bosnia, he said, well, I guess the line starts and ends with you. And the same was Gaza. Nobody ever wanted it. So all the jobs that I wanted, nobody wanted. Yeah. And I don't think it's accidental that when I came back from overseas, I immediately started teaching in the prison system. Sure. And because it's those relationships, you know, you don't want the oppressed to be an abstraction. No. Those relationships, they keep you angry in a good way. And yeah, I mean, it's also love. But yeah.
With love,
yeah. Yeah, well, my students in the prison always laugh because at the end, you never cry in a prison except for me. I always cry in the last class because I'm leaving them behind. Yeah. And I think it saves you from cynicism.
Sure.
And just one final point is that, you know, working in Gaza, for instance, I'm American, white, male. I come from privilege, and privilege is blindness, as Shakespeare points out in Lear. Lear can't see until everything is stripped away from him on the heath. And so, yes, I speak Arabic, yes, I lived in Gaza, but I have to recognize that I can never fully see. I have to recognize that blindness given from where I come from. And if you recognize that blindness, whether it's in Gaza or whether it's in an American prison, you can have real, substantial relationships with the oppressed. And I think that that's been a constant throughout. I've always seen my journalism as holding power to account, whatever that power is, and always standing on the side of those, you know, whether they're Palestinians. I spent a lot of time with the Kurds. You know, that for me is what journalism is.
One of the questions that is here in front of me is about why it is that American Christians, especially on the right, don't react when Israel targets Christian sites, when Christian sites in Gaza are destroyed, as they have been. I mean, when you talked about your father's attitude to the Christians that he encountered, I mean, How does that, what would it take, do you think, for those people to see Palestinian Christians for who they are?
Well, they're fascists. I mean, they're not going to see, they kneel before the god of white supremacy. I mean, let's be clear, this is a deeply racist movement. Yeah. And, I mean, you're watching Trump now decapitate any person of color, and they just fired a black admiral today or yesterday. This is a movement that, I mean, and he just reconfigured immigration laws to give priority to white immigrants. I mean, and we of course all know the superiority of white people. All you have to do is look at Donald Trump and Ann Bondi and Hegseth. I mean, these are really exemplars of, I mean, so they're completely racist, and they love Israel. They're also anti-Semites. I mean, that's the other funny part. But yeah, they are anti-Semites. Because they all, you know, they'll always talk about how the Jews killed Jesus. Oh, the Jews didn't kill Jesus. The Romans killed Jesus. And first of all, Jesus wasn't white. The Romans were white. Jesus was a person of color. But they are a political movement, and they are a fascistic movement that celebrates American violence, that celebrates all the tropes of fascism, hypermasculinity, patriarchy. I mean, look at Charlie Kirk. I mean, this guy was a bigot and a racist, and was shutting down, you know, camp. He had Professor Watch, like camera, you know, going after. And if you criticize him on X, especially if you're not American, people are losing their jobs over this. He's gotten the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and this guy is, I mean, but he's emblematic of this Christian fascist movement.
Well, he's a martyr now, isn't he?
Yeah, he's been beatified, yeah, completely.
Before we finish up, and I'd like to thank you very much for being such a quiet audience, for the most part. Obviously, you're here and we're talking about your book, Genocide Foretold. I wondered if you would share with the audience anything you've read that you think is well worth reading in terms of helping them to make sense of what is going on in Gaza at the moment.
There's several books that I like. A Perfect Victim,
Muhammad
al-Kurd, One Day Everyone Will Bend Against This.
Omar Allah.
Both of them are very fine writers, by the way. Mm-hmm. I mean, Rashid Halidi's 100-Year War is very good. You have to be grounded in historical context. I mean, Benny Morris, who's like awful, but Righteous Victims is a good book. I mean, I don't, you know,
absolutely.
He covers himself by being a cheerleader for the genocide, but his historical research is important. Mm-hmm. Avi Shlaim is very good. I mean, there's a lot of really good writers. Norman Finkelstein has written some great stuff. You know, the book I really like on the Middle East, which I recommend to everyone on the modern Middle East, is Robert Fisk's The Great War for Civilization. I say because Fisk, who was a friend of mine, he was not only a great journalist and a great writer, he had a PhD from Trinity College Dublin, so he understood the context. And he was on the ground. I think if you really want to understand the deep betrayal of the Muslim world, and particularly the Arab world, Fisk, it's a big book.
It's a massive
book, but it's beautifully written. It's a great book.
It's a massive book.
Along with Pity the Nation.
Yes. Which is shorter, but very good as well.
Yeah, so those are big.
It's funny you should mention how big the book is, because I worked with Robert at The Independent in the late 90s, early noughties. And whenever Robert filed, our computer system at The Independent, the story would fit on the page in front of us, and then all the extra words, we would have to draw on the computer screen a column, and another column, and another column. And the bottom of each column, if it was red, that meant there were still more words. And then when it was black, that meant you'd reached the end. And I remember always with Robert, when his copy arrived, I would have like 8 columns copy, and it was still red. And I would phone him and say, Robert, you know how big our pages are. What is this? But he was amazing to work with, and he always, it's not so much that he was always right or that he was always correct, because he required plenty of editing from my experience, but it was that he always tried to put the people he was talking to in front of himself. He always tried to present you with them rather than presenting you with his opinion or his analysis. And that was what made him, for me, so important. But it's great to hear you remember him, because I worked with him and I wrote to him before I worked with him and got a beautiful response from him. To me, there is a mission there, which is to put the voices of those people, the people of Gaza, in front of us so that everybody can see them. And of course, that's what the journalists like Anas al-Sharif, who's depicted there, and like Rushdie Sarraj, who died while he was working for the ABC, and like Hibal Abadli and so many others were trying to do. They were trying to put the stories of their people in front of us. And for those of them who died and for those of them who are still living, I think what I would like to say at the end is that what you said in a way, which is we can't afford to look away. It costs too much. So I hope that all of you here tonight will not look away, and you'll keep coming to events like this, and you'll keep giving people like Chris Hedges your attention. I'd like to leave it there. Chris, is there anything you'd like to say?
No, I think that's beautiful, and it's, I have so much admiration for these journalists, because they know that it's almost guaranteed that they'll be killed.
Yes.
And they stand up anyway on behalf of these people who are being crucified, and they themselves are crucified. Oh. And when we talk about anger, my anger is that we in the Western press have not stood with them.
I might prevail on everyone for a couple more moments of